Hey guys, it's Michelle, and I'm here to talk about my favorite book so far of 2015. Yes, it's already July, and yes, the year is already half gone. I have 6 books on my list. I had more books that were 5 stars, but these are the ones that I really felt stood out above and beyond. So I'm going to talk about 3 books that I read digitally, and then 3 books that I have physical copies of. First on my list is actually a collection of short stories, and I had never read one prior to this year, but I'm starting to read them and really enjoy that kind of, I don't know if you'd call it a genre or whatever, but that kind of a setup. It was called 40 Tales of the Afterlives. It's by David Eagleman. He's a neuroscientist. He has a TED Talk about how the brain processes information from senses, and it is phenomenal. And the research they are doing to help people who are blind or deaf interpret the world, oh my gosh, it was just mind-blowing. But anyway, this collection, which I have no idea how he found the time to write it, was just so creative and so thought-provoking and so funny at times, and it just gave me a completely different view on people's ideas of the afterlives. And it's really just a lens to look at how we live our lives, while we're living them versus when they're over. So really enjoyed that. Of course, all the books on this list I gave 5 stars to. Next up is the Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson, and this is the best fantasy series I have ever read. Brandon Sanderson is just the king of writing fantasy for me. I just was sucked right into the world. I loved the characters. He has this way of creating what I call a sandbox. It's kind of like a playground for me as a reader. He explains the characters. He explains a little bit of the politics. He explains how the magic system works, or at least little pieces of it. And then he just keeps layering on information as the story goes on, and you get to put together pieces of how things work. And sometimes you're right and sometimes you're not. But it is such an incredible reading experience above and beyond anything else. And the ending of this trilogy was just the best. And if anything ever beats that ending in my mind, you will be hearing about it loud and proud on my channel for sure. Alright, next up is Lock-In by John Scalzi. This is my first Scalzi. First, I read the prequel novella that is available free on Tor.com. I believe it's called Unlocked, and it's like an oral history of this disease called Hayden's syndrome. Basically, in stage 3 of Hayden's syndrome, the patient can no longer control their body, and so they have to be on kind of life support and that kind of thing, but their mind is completely intact. And so it's this history of how the disease was discovered and the different approaches to treating it and dealing with it, and how are we going to keep this 5 to 10% of the population kind of like active, productive citizens, and the different approaches that were considered and the politics behind that. And it was simply fascinating. I had to keep telling myself this is not a real disease, because as I was reading it, it felt like it was a real history of a disease. So the book Lock-In actually starts with a character who has Hayden syndrome, and he interfaces through the world with a Threep, which is kind of like a robot that looks a little like C-3PO. And he's just gotten hired by the FBI for a division that investigates Hayden's related crimes. And there were just a lot of fascinating ideas in here. The characters were extremely diverse, and John Scalzi's writing is just awesome. There's this perfect balance of action and investigation and comedy and human relations and just all that stuff. Kind of reminded me of Rush Hour. When I was reading it, I was like, the balance of this is just awesome. And that's what I think of when I think of the Rush Hour type movies. All right, so the books that I have a physical copy of that made my list. First is The Enchanted by Renee Denfeld. This is set in a prison, and it's about one of the inmates who kind of escapes the not so nice parts of being in prison through reading books. So that's the part I focused on. But it is set in a prison, so there is some stuff in here that is a little difficult to stomach. It's not really graphically described, but hinted at. And if you have a trigger for any kind of abuse, I might avoid this one. But this is really an exploration of mental illness and how our society deals with it, or in most cases doesn't deal with it. It explores things like capital punishment and the morality of that. It explores things like overcoming shame. And you're basically getting the viewpoint of one inmate who's observing people who work at the prison, people who are part of the prison. There is a neat writing device that she uses in here. She herself has done the job of working with death row inmates to try to build a case to get them off of death row. So that's, I think, one of the reasons this holds so much weight, but the writing is so good, and this book is simply magical and really made me think about a lot of things that I hadn't previously considered. Loved it for that. If you had told me that a graphic novel series was going to make my list, I probably would not have believed you, but it has, and it's phenomenal. It is Chew by Rob Layman and Rob Giori. I have read the first two. I have volumes 3 and 4 that I need to get around to reading. This is John Chew, and he's a detective, and he has a special ability. When he eats anything, he can kind of tell the history of it. If he eats an orange, he can tell you where it was grown. He can tell you what kind of pesticides were used on it. That applies to meat-based products too, including human. He works for the FDA, and because chicken is outlawed due to the avian flu, the FDA is kind of like the big powerhouse of law enforcement agencies. And so he works for them, wielding quite a bit of power, but he's a rookie, and he has, kind of the veteran showing him the ropes kind of thing. This is just gross. It is hilarious, and it is creative, and it is super entertaining, and I can't believe how much I like this. It is so good. Let me show you a little bit of the artwork. If you have not seen it before, that's probably not the most representative page ever. Probably not appropriate for all audiences. A lot of violence in it, and like I said, it is disgusting. You might not want to eat it might not want to read it at dinner time, but it is so good. Definitely, if you're looking for a graphic novel to pick up and you don't mind a little gruesomeness, that would be an excellent one to pick up. And finally on my list is Redeployment by Phil Clay. This is a collection of short stories revolving around Marines involved in the Iraq wars, and this was so impactful and so powerful, and I just feel like it's so important. It just gave me a really visceral view of that war and when Marines are involved in it, and I loved how many different perspectives we got in here, although they kind of seemed like one voice-ish. That conflict and our Marines being there was just so complicated, and there were so many aspects to it that those of us at home never once considered or never took into account, and this book just kind of opened my eyes to a lot of that, and for that I really thank Phil Clay for writing this. And I just really think this should be required reading for anyone who has a vote on whether or not we send troops into a foreign country that we don't really understand. In the future, maybe that would help out a little bit. I don't know, but definitely powerful, definitely insightful, difficult to read, but in my mind, extremely important. So, there you have it. Those are my top 6 picks for 2015 so far. Please comment below if you've read any of these or plan to read any of these or agree or disagree with anything I've said. Thank you so much for watching, and happy reading.